this year, the Midwell Institute made 3 scholarships available to medical students who are doing good for their colleagues, who are working for the good of their community of medical students. What I think made these scholarships quite unique was that there wasn't a panel who voted on them. The voting was actually done by the medical students themselves. I am a real believer, I've said this before and I'll say it again, that our profession and the challenges that we're facing are going to be solved by our profession. They're going to be solved by us as a collective, by us, for us, which is why I wanted these scholarships to be awarded in the same way, by us, for us. Colleagues recognising and acknowledging their colleagues. We had 179 nominees for the scholarships and I was just blown away. I read them all by the amazing work that these medical students are doing to look out for each other, from the sort of the smallest kindnesses to some amazing programs that medical students are implementing. It was so heartening. And I think the other part that was so heartening was that 1,115 students voted for the recipients. So they got involved because I think they really wanted to acknowledge their peers. Maysam Asedy is the Australian recipient of the Midwell Institute Scholarship. She was voted on by her peers for the work she's doing for the well-being of her fellow students, and we're going to have a conversation now. So welcome, Maysam.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Oh, it's awesome to have you here, and look, congratulations on receiving the scholarship and being, acknowledged by your peers. I guess that's the piece to me that's really cool. So, I mean, how did it feel when you were voted, the most deserving medical student, for the work you're doing in Australia?
I mean, yeah, it was quite a surprise, and I just felt really grateful to have that. And I think, like you said, the fact that it was decided by medical students rather than a panel similar to other scholarships made me feel that the work that sort of we had done with Wellbeing had really touched people and was able to help them. So I think that was quite a and rewarding experience and something that I was quite grateful for.
I mean, that's the thing, isn't it? It's, the people who get to vote are the people who are benefiting, or who can see the benefits to, for the work that you're doing. So, yeah, just congratulations again.
Thank you.
Maysam was a founder of Wellbeing Days at her medical school. She saw a need to, I guess, we're going to explore it, but to give people that flexibility and freedom to prioritize themselves. And I think this is such a positive step in the right direction to shifting the culture we have, in healthcare, which is sacrifice everything for our patients because they come first, to, well, I'm going to look after myself because my patients deserve me at my best. So today we're going to talk about Maysam's medical school experience. We're going to talk about the work that she's been doing in wellbeing. And we're also going to cover off some suggestions for anyone who has an interest in getting involved in, promoting and enabling well-being amongst their colleagues. So I'm really looking forward to this conversation. So Maysam, let's start with your medical school experience. Tell us a bit about your background, why medicine, and how you ended up at medical school.
Yeah, so I think medicine wasn't really something that I'd always thought I was going to do growing up. I wasn't really one of those people who had that idea, but I ended up taking a gap year and deciding on medicine. And I think one of the main reasons I sort of went to medicine was primarily because you're able to help people and sort of make decisions and problem solving in order to reach a solution or and be able to help people. But also secondary because I found that the job was so flexible. So in terms of specialties, there's something for everyone. And in terms of actually structuring your week, once you finish training and things like that, you can go into part-time clinical work, you can go into teaching, you can go into research. And I think, as a teenager fresh out of high school, I liked the idea that I didn't have to sort of commit to a single type of work where it would be the same every day. And I think that in combination with being involved with people and being able to help them when they're the most vulnerable really drew me to medicine.
I mean, you touched on a couple of things there. I think, one, I remember I was speaking to groups of graduating medical students around the country, and throughout the whole of New Zealand. And I asked everyone, what was your reason for getting into medicine? The entire country, a major driver was to help people. One guy put his hand up for the money. And so that's not bad out of 600. So, but that driver to help people, I think, is such an important part that's baked into, us as medical professions. That's what we're here to do. We all know it and we all live it. And, this conversation about well-being is so important because to me, the biggest barrier to us helping people is the way we're looking after ourselves. Because if you've got 2 and 3 doctors who are in burnout, that means, the part of that is we stop caring. We stop actually really, having this driver to help people. And we still help people, but it's not at the same level. And I think that's why this conversation about well-being is so, so important. And I think another thing that you touched on, which I think is a really important point actually for medical students, I've interviewed a lot of doctors on this podcast around well-being and, burnout and what people can do. And one of the important messages that keeps coming through is that medicine is flexible. We sometimes can get the blinkers on and think that it isn't, that there's this one path and I'm locked in and I'm locked into 80-hour weeks for the rest of my life. But actually you are so right. And, as we speak to ones, with a few more grey hairs than you, we've a few people with a bit more experience and down the track a bit further, looking back, they will say, treat it flexibly, and enjoy that flexibility. And the other part of that is it's not a race. I love the fact that you took a gap year because, that's one of the big pieces of advice that these more senior doctors, myself included, is when you're in it as a medical student and then you become a junior doctor, you can compare yourself very closely to where your peers are, who's on a training program, who's not. And actually, by the time you get to my age at 46, did it matter if you got on a training program at 29 or 31 or 32? It doesn't matter at all. So if we kind of take this mindset, then I think the way you're doing, which is it's not a race and there's a whole lot of flexibility. Which means you put those two things together, I can take the time to find what I love and what works for me. That's how you find an amazingly fulfilling career in medicine.
Yeah, I hope so, yeah.
I'm sure you will. So you got to medical school and you noticed burnout was a problem.
Yeah.
Can you talk to me about that?
Yeah, so I think something that was quite good within my medical school was the topics around well-being and burnout was something that was brought up pretty early on, both by the medical school and by the medical society there. And the medical society often organised lots of events with a peak body called DASWA, which is about doctors' health. And I think within those conversations, something that always stood out to me was there's a big focus on doctors' health and mental health, which is important as it should be. But I sort of wondered how students were just expected to graduate and somehow be able to take care of their mental health and self-care. And I felt that sometimes the onus is on the students and on the junior doctors to come up with a solution in a system which is new to them and programs which are new to them and be able to do all these things. And I think there is definitely an element where it has to be driven by yourself and you're the only person that can really take care of yourself. But at the same time, having resources and programs from the outside can also definitely help facilitate that as well. So I think I definitely noticed that, around the medical school, everyone just sort of at certain points in the year just seemed really over it, for lack of better words, and just tired. And I think I remember this was right before a wellbeing event, and I was thinking in my head, well, it's a bit difficult to sort of expect everyone to graduate as a doctor with lots of responsibilities and people's lives sort of, as part of that responsibility, and yet you still don't really know how to, take care of yourself, or say that you haven't had a good night's sleep, or say that XYZ is happening in your life and so you need to step back. And I think that's really important to be able to recognize.
Absolutely. It's interesting because when we spoke, I reflected back to my time at medical school, which was over 20 years ago. And, it was different. Burnout wasn't an issue. And this is, all my research, most of my research over the years has been into doctor burnout. And it's only in the last while that I've realised that it's actually become a problem now in medical students. My assumption was, well, it was fine when I was there, so we're all good. But it isn't now. And I think a couple of things. I mean, I think it's great that there is a focus on it now. And when we lobbied the World Medical Association to amend the modern-day Hippocratic Oath, the Declaration of Geneva, to include the health and well-being of doctors, I'll take care of myself and my abilities in order to provide care of the highest standard. That meant, that it's on everyone's agenda. And so that's a good thing. However, burnout is increasing. So why do you think that burnout is a problem now in medical school? Because there are certain things that you have and challenges that we didn't have.
Yeah, and I can't really compare to how
No.
medical school was before because obviously I haven't been there. But I think something that comes to mind is that there's lots of high expectations now, and I think with having information so readily available, being able to pull out therapeutic guidelines on your phone and journal articles really quickly, there does seem to be a higher expectation, and that's something that's sort of been echoed by senior doctors I've spoken to, by tutors, that the knowledge that we have is amazing and it's incredible that we can access it, but it also means that we're expected to access it, if that makes sense.
Absolutely.
So being up to date, I think even just within medical school, I think the screening guidelines for cancer in Australia for 3 different cancers had changed twice or 3 times.
Right.
And then you have to sort of be up to date with all of that, which reflects obviously how you have to be as a doctor, but also means that as a student who's learning and, you have to be able to access all that information. So I think that higher expectation is something. And I think just another thing would be the cost of living as well. So
Absolutely.
something that I've noticed with a lot of students is, thankfully I live at home, but with a lot of other students who live out of home, who are renting, they're finding it really difficult to work and then be on placement or work and study medicine. And I think that's something to consider as well, with even just the cost of renting and the cost of buying a house that's elevated remarkably in Australia. I can't speak for New Zealand,
Same in
but
New Zealand, yeah.
has elevated remarkably, and people are worried. And it for a lot of people, it's become that medical school isn't the main focus. It's being able to work, get a job, have money, be able to pay rent. And I think that's a big difference as well.
Absolutely. And when we were speaking, that really hit me because, rent was pretty cheap back when I was at medical school. Like the cost of living wasn't that expensive. You look at, somewhere like Sydney now, and I saw something recently, it said for the average family, they need to have an income of over $250,000 a year to live well. Now, obviously this is not an average family when you're a medical student, but it just goes to show it's like the amount that medical students have on the whole to live is far below what it actually takes in some of those areas where the medical schools are, aren't they?
Yeah.
I think the other thing that, I'm not sure if this is something that you noticed, but, when I was at medical school, it was a small world we lived in. We didn't have phones in our pockets that could tell us everything, and Trump and, what's going on in Israel and Russia, and, we didn't have all that because it's just like we live in this little world where you guys are exposed to just a whole lot more, aren't you? Your bandwidth gets taken up, like the world is sort of both contracted and expanded at the same time.
Yeah, and I think constantly having feedback of all, the horrible things going on in the world and things like that, I think it can put a toll on people without them realizing as well. Just thinking about, just all the different things, and even with we had a recent federal election in Australia, a lot of people were quite stressed about that as well, and
Interesting.
how it would affect the healthcare system, especially I'm in my final year, so that was a topic that was quite prevalent amongst my peers, and how it would affect us going into working and things like that. So I think there's lots of things going around in the world, tragedies and even things locally, that have put some sort of subconscious pressure. It's difficult to sort of go on your phone and then see, healthcare facilities under stress, or people in war zones, people in Gaza, people in all these different places that have tragedies going on, and then go back to
Yeah.
studying. It's a bit difficult.
Yeah, I think the takeaway for me is it's harder to be a medical student now. You know, you've got the demands and the high expectations. And I think about that, like we didn't have access to everything. So we were expected to learn a certain amount, but it was at a medical school student amount. You're expected to learn that as well as have access to everything else and be able to draw on it as required. So it's, you know, added that pressure. You've got these, you know, the world exposure to all these things that are going on. So it's just kind of eating into the bandwidth that you have available, combined with the cost of living and stuff. Like, it's harder to be a medical student. So, you know, that's why we did the scholarships. We really wanted to acknowledge both the work that was been done and, you know, obviously provide some financial assistance to some. We can't provide it to enough. Would love to have given it to everyone. But yeah, so I just think, you know, having some empathy, you know, because a lot of the audience is doctors, and I think, you know, doctors work, you know, we interact with medical students, and I just think it's worthwhile having that empathy that it's harder now than it was for us, rather than just going, well, we got through, so you should be fine. The playing field has changed. Like, there's no question it's harder. So, you know, and that's why, you know, burnout wasn't a problem when I was at medical school. It is now. You know, depending on where you look, it can be anything from 50% to 80% of med students are in burnout. So it matters. So why did you take an interest in well-being?
Yeah, I think just noticing how burnt out everyone was, and it kind of happened at a time, the same time I took on a role within my medical student society, which was being an equity director, which also encapsulated student well-being and things like that as well. I sort of would notice everyone just being tired, myself included, and seeing that everyone, that sort of dread before exams and things like that. And the fact that this was discussed, this idea of well-being, it wasn't a novel idea that I just come up with. It was something that was being discussed in my medical school. So I think yeah, like sort of I was saying earlier, it just made sense to me that in order to be able to have good well-being as a doctor, you need to sort of practice these things as a medical student, and that a lot of it is self-reflective and making the time, but at the same time, it would be a big help to have resources and people in senior positions sort of looking out for you and also making that culture, like facilitating that culture really.
Absolutely. And so, you know, you got onto a wellbeing working group, and how did you go about facilitating that culture?
I think, you know, it wasn't something that I did on my own, so I have to sort of acknowledge that I was quite grateful that I had other students on the committee as well who were able to sort of help that
Absolutely.
as well. I think it was mainly facilitated by also having staff who were interested in this topic as well. It's
Hmm.
all well and good having a well-being group amongst students, but if there's a connection with a staff member or multiple staff members, that means that the things that we're saying is actually reaching the places where it needs to go and be able to make those decisions and things like that. So I think that was a big help, and that meant that we weren't just having discussions with nothing happening out of it, but we were having discussions, and those discussions were being carried on in the medical school as well.
Absolutely. And so talk to me about how you came up with the well-being days and what your experience was with those, and how they've been helpful.
Yeah, so I think it this was interesting with the well-being days as well because it sort of happened with a few different people having the idea at once. But I remember thinking in after a talk, I was having a chat with someone and they were saying, "Oh, I wish instead of this well-being talk, I just had a day off." And I went, "Yeah, I understand that." And then I thought about it and I said, "Yeah, why don't we have days off?" Because I think you see students in other degrees and they have attendance requirements, but it's not that sort of firm, almost 100% requirement where if you miss a lecture, you have to provide a reason. It's a lot more flexible in that regards, and especially with other degrees, it's well, if you don't show up, you're affecting yourself, and no one's really going to care as much.
Hmm.
But that is quite different in medicine with the expectation that you're there all the time, which is reasonable, I think, having a higher expectation, but also it means that, students don't have days off. So I remember having a chat to a few people in the committee at the time, and then some other students were saying, yeah, we also had a similar idea of, you know, we need some sort of a break. And I
Mm.
think it was when I sort of brought it up in the wellbeing working group and said, hey, to the staff, hey, what if we had wellbeing days? And I remember sort of pausing and waiting to see what the initial reaction was, because I didn't know what the reaction was going to be. But thankfully they were quite supportive, and it sort of began the year and a half-ish process of having to get those wellbeing days sort of embedded into the course as well.
Yeah, right. And you went. Tell us about how you got it going and what you learned, and how you're improving the system.
Yeah, so I think this was something that was discussed by multiple people in the wellbeing working group. So firstly, having that support and not just being a lone student coming up with an idea was definitely a help.
Hmm.
I think it was really clear that if there was any sort of pushback around it, it wasn't because staff members didn't want this to happen. It was probably because there's logistics and things like that that we need to consider. So myself and another student ended up sitting down and writing some guidelines just to make it really clear of when wellbeing days were applicable, when you couldn't take one. So obviously, during an exam,
Yeah.
you probably can't take a wellbeing day, but other things like that where there's specific requirements for the course, making it clear that wellbeing days shouldn't interfere with that, but rather be more of a respite when you sort of need it. And based on that, having something written down and having it not sort of up in the air made the program a lot more realistic and, I guess, feasible from both
Yep.
ends.
Yep.
And then it ended up starting up with a trial. So I think it was the second semester of a year where they put out this information and said, we're starting out a pilot program for the wellbeing days, and then we'll see how it goes. And I remember a lot of students saying, this is, great, and this is what we want, and this is helpful. And we ended up running a survey at the end of that just to get students' perspectives on what helped and what improvements there could be. And at the same time, also having a meeting with staff to see where they were at. So this was at the end of semester 2 so I think it was around 2022, the end of 2022.
Mm.
And then I remember going into 2023, I wasn't holding the equity director role that I had, but I had been offered a new role by the medical school, where I could be involved with curriculum and a lot of other discussions with the staff as well. So the discussion about wellbeing days was still happening at the same time. And I remember I had not heard of the wellbeing days being used for a couple of weeks, and I was sort of wondering what happened with that, and had a chat to some of the staff as well, and they identified some issues or some things that we hadn't really thought about with the wellbeing days. So then that meant we had another meeting with the wellbeing group and sat down and sort of really thought about how we could address sort of concerns from both sides, and then make sure that it wasn't affecting attendance to a large degree as well.
Right.
And I think the openness with staff who were willing to communicate with us, and then the dedication of students as well, meant we were able to sort of come up with new revised guidelines and then send those out again. And then at the same time, there was also a survey from the staff's end as well for all the students and the staff by the end of that sort of second semester as well.
Mm.
And then, it was sort of, basically to sum up what I've said, basically a trial with sort of continuous improvement throughout that ended up spanning a while. But at the end of the day, it did sort of get solidified and put into our medical school sort of learning system. So it says it on the side, wellbeing days, and there's some information about it. And I think that sort of goes to show that, as a student, there's certain things that you might not be aware of in the medical school and how it runs, and some projects may not align with that. But if you've got people on the other end who are willing to communicate with you and come up with a solution, then you can still sort of make changes within the medical school.
That's brilliant. And what sort of feedback have you got about the impact of these wellbeing days?
I've gotten such, I guess, heartwarming feedback from students, and even till now, even after the scholarship, I've had students in younger years reaching out to me and say, "Oh, I didn't know that this was a student-led director. I thought this was just a thing that was there." It's gotten good feedback. I've had from people say that they just needed a day to just sit in bed or just relax. I've had students say that they just really needed a time to do XYZ or had something going on and they needed that day to have a break. And I think something that stood out in one of the first surveys that we ran, was someone said anonymously that this was one of the first wellbeing initiatives they felt actually made a difference.
Wow.
And I think that goes to show that having practical changes rather than just putting all the onus on students does make a difference and helps people prioritize their mental health and their well-being.
You're so right. I've heard from so many doctors as well who say, look, having a mindfulness talk at lunchtime while I'm sitting with my pager trying to eat my lunch isn't particularly helpful. You know, we've actually got to be practical, as you have been, and not ideological. And I think that's a great learning for anyone who's trying to implement well-being. Like, medicine is a practical profession. But we have to think practically and think about how things can, you know, and the wider effects, the second order consequences of things, which you've done, which means you've been able to implement something that is genuinely helpful, and fits in within what is a relatively complex system. I think it's brilliant.
Yeah, and I think it was, yeah, really great having other students also support, and it came at a time where I think a lot of people were quite burnt out. Sort of the discussions happened towards the end of the first semester, and then by
Right.
the time we sort of implemented it, beginning of the second semester. So I think I didn't I don't think I actually thought that it would be solidified. I just sort of went, let's just try and see what happens.
Brilliant. Have you heard if this is spread to any other medical schools?
So I do know that some other medical schools across Australia have heard about this and have reached out. I don't know 100% sort of where they're at, but by the time we had sort of revised second guidelines and written out a clear document, I
Mm,
do know that some medical schools and some, because the committee leads are across the different medical schools all have meetings, they were made aware of this. So
right.
all those guidelines and things like that were sort of shared with them, and I do hope that they were able to implement something like that as
Yeah,
well.
brilliant. I hope so too. I think that's one of the great things about, you know, the way we're going to move things forward in healthcare and with for doctors is by sharing the collective intelligence. You know, good ideas that are, I mean, this is the great thing about this. It's a good idea that has a good impact that's easy. You know, so
Yeah.
it's kind of got all the elements. So, what medical school are you at, just in case anyone who's listening is in a position to, you know, be able to do something like this at their at a medical school, whether they're a doctor or a med student, and they want to reach out to your med school to get the guidelines. Because again, you don't have to reinvent the wheel. You guys have done a lot of the work already. What medical
Yeah,
school are you at?
I'm at Curtin, and I think one of the easier ways would be to sort of contact the Curtin Association of Medical Students.
Perfect.
So they've got a website, and they'd sort of there's an email I believe on there as well. So it'd be quite easy to sort of contact them through that.
Perfect. Perfect. So anyone listening, it's just a very easy thing to be implementing that, you know, just takes this, you know, I guess the thing is I look at, you know, it's a hard job being a med student. Um, and, you know, anything that can just relieve that pressure a little bit when it's needed is going to be so, so valuable and so, so important. So, look, thank you. I think one of the things you're doing here as a medical student is leading the way in terms of prioritizing well-being. You know, I said it to any medical student I meet, you know, med school is the time to learn how to manage your well-being as a doctor because it's only going to get more challenging once you start as a junior doctor. So now's the time to think about looking after yourself and keeping up the things you enjoy and looking after your, you know, your sleep and your exercise and your diet and things like that. Because if you let it go in med school, you're kind of playing catch up once you become a doctor. And I think, you know, and I think, you know, the one of the lessons here as well for anyone listening who is a doctor is support is important, isn't it? You know, you got immediate
Yeah.
support, and I've heard that before. And I was interviewing a doctor. His name's Richard. He's head of ED in Dunedin, and he said, look, the thing is, if we're going to talk about well-being being important, how you interact with your junior doctors is important. The moment they come to you and go, look, I want to take off 3 years, 3 week months next year to go on a trip to do this, whatever, your response has got to be fantastic, great. How can we make that happen? Because if your response is always like, oh, really? You know, you're just quietly reinforcing, actually, no, the job always comes first. And, you know, we have to, you know, we are the only ones who are going to change the culture from being sacrifice everything for our patients to look after myself so I can provide the best care possible to our patients. Like, we're all part of the solution. And you know, it's so inspiring seeing you leading the way there in medical school.
Thank you.
So, Maysam, this has been a fantastic conversation. You know, again, congratulations on the scholarship and the work you've been doing, the impact it's having. what suggestions, I'd like to leave, you with the final thoughts. What suggestions would you have for anyone who has an interest in, being part of the solution?
Yeah, it's been great having this conversation too, and I do hope that anyone listening to this can sort of be inspired. But I think something that's always stuck with me is the idea that if you don't ask, the answer's always no. So I think I was under the impression with the Wellbeing Days that they weren't going to happen, but I still went, okay, what's the worst that can happen? They say no. Then we're back
Mm,
to where we started. We're not in a worse position. So let's just try and sort of see where that takes us. And I think something that's really good is while sort of we've through this talk we've acknowledged that maybe the demands of medical students now are higher, at the same time there is a focus on well-being.
mm,
So I can speak for Australia where even within the Australian accreditation guidelines, there's an entire section on student well-being.
yeah.
So if anyone has any difficulty with, I guess, not knowing how to word things, where to focus their efforts on well-being, even just going back to the accreditation guidelines is a good
Mm,
way to go. I can't speak for New Zealand, but I assume there'd be something similar, or at the
absolutely.
very least, yeah, at the very least, can speak to universities and to university guidelines. And I think it's about working with people in universities and seeing where they're coming from and seeing valid concerns and working with other students as well to see where the gaps are and where a good program could sort of fill those gaps or at least fill some of those gaps as well.
Brilliant. I think, what I love about your approach is it's practical. It takes into account the fact that we have to work within a system, and also it assumes good intent. And that's been my experience with all these interviews and the people I talk to. We want to get better. As a profession, we're trying to, my generation is trying to leave it better than we found it. And actually, there is caring about the next generation and your well-being, and actually making healthcare a better place where we don't just churn people up and spit them out and burn out. I think there is an appetite, and so what it's going to take is people like you, ideas like you have, and people like the staff you talked to who said, great, let's give it a go. And so that to me is such an inspiring part of your story, and I'm very grateful that you've shared it.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you for having a chat with me, and obviously thank you for the scholarship and being able to highlight what an important issue this is. And I think if people are able to sort of recognize when their well-being is poor, when they need more support, that's the first step in being able to provide the best care for patients. So I hope that, people can work and start to sort of recognize these things.
Absolutely. Well, hopefully with conversations like this happening more and more, that becomes more and more the norm.
Yeah, hopefully.
Brilliant. Well, thank you, Maysam. Congratulations again. Thank you for sharing your wisdom and insights with us. I'm sure anyone listening has had huge value. And I'd just like to, once again, thank you for your time.
Thank you.